Hello! Welcome. Did some audio tests at the beginning. We should be good to go. Just giving a little bit of a buffer here in case people are late. Hello, Wiz. So real quick, just a brief overview of what I'm all going to be covering today. Today, I'm going to go over the main story of Final Fantasy XIV. I did the same thing about 2 years ago, right before Endwalker came out, and in that presentation, I covered a lot of the trials, a lot of the trials in the Alliance raids, in the raid series. I'm not going to be doing that for this one, just for the sake of keeping it under 2 hours, if I can get it under 2 hours. The only exception is I will be covering the Crystal Tower storyline, just very briefly, just because, one, that is now something that's required for the MSQ, and two, it ties into a lot of stuff from Shadowbringers. But yeah, this is going to be a relatively... I'm going to skim over a lot of details. The goal of this is just to kind of get a sense of, the world, and get a sense of the events that have led us up to Dawntrail. And yeah, so I might not talk about specific characters as much, or talk about how those characters have grown. So don't expect too much of that. If I glance over something and you feel like that's important, I will be looking at chat. So if there are any questions as I get to the end of each expansion, if you do have any questions about the lore, about stuff I talked about, or about stuff I didn't talk about, just throw that in the chat, and I'll look over questions as we get to the end of each expansion. So, so let's start out. We're going to start with just kind of a more general overview. So, first we're kind of going to talk about the 1.0 side of things. So, starting out, right, we live on a planet called Hydaelyn. So, that's the name of the world that we live on, and Hydaelyn is comprised of a bunch of different continents. It's actually kind of meant to, mirror the world, the planet Earth a little bit, which actually, unironically, kind of gives us some speculation for what Dawntrail is going to look like, because it's supposed to be kind of North and South America. But, so Hydaelyn has a couple continents we'll go over. It's made up of Aldenard, Ilsabard, Othard, Miracidia, and Tural. So first we have Aldenard. Aldenard is the continent that we start out on. That's where Eorzea is. So Aldenard, Eorzea, you're going to have locations like Lenoshka, Thanalan, the Shroud. Those are kind of where the three starting areas are. You'll also have Kurthus and the nation of Ishgard around there. You'll also have Mordona, Girabanya, a bunch of other locations too, but Eorzea is where we start our adventure. Next up, you have Ilsabard. So, Ilsabard, we learned a lot about in Endwalker for sure. So you have the Republic of Garlemald there. You have Bosnia. You have Corvos, which is directly below Garlemald. You also have Thavnair. You have Werlet. So that primarily has been under control of the Garlean Empire. Maybe not so much Thavnair, but there's been a lot of Garlemald-related activities happening over in Ilsabard. Then we have Othard, the Far East. So you'll have areas like Doma, the Azib Steppe, Yangsha, Dalmasca, or what was formerly known as Dalmasca. And also you'll have the area of Hingashi. That's where the city of Kugane is. And then we have Tural. That's where we're going to in Dawntrail. So this was referred to as the New World for a long time. The only thing that we knew about it prior to all this stuff about Dawntrail is that's where the home of the Wallaki tribe is from. If you did any Blue Mage quests, you would know about the Wallaki tribe. We also knew that there was a lot of, I think there was a lot of Mikote that came from over there, and they also brought with them a lot of goods, a lot of food came over from the New World. But that's where Yoktaral is, Zaktoral, Tuliolal. Tuliyollal being the capital city that we're going to, probably at the beginning of Dawntrail. We then have Mericidia. I'm assuming that's where Mericidia is, because from what we understand, Mericidia is essentially the Australia of Final Fantasy XIV. So there's not too much that we know about it at this point. We know that it is the former home of the dragons. So we know that that's kind of where, like, Midgardsormr kind of, like, started a lot of the dragons. There's not much known about it today. We know that there was a war fought over there. I think it was, like, during the Third Astral Era between the Allagan Empire and the Mericidian Horde, and we don't exactly know what all was left because of that war, but we can assume that there probably is a couple of desolate areas there because of that. And then last, we also have the Northern Empty, not one of the main continents, but it's worth noting about the Northern Empty because we spent a lot of time there in Endwalker. So that's kind of like the old world. That's where Old Sharlayan is, and also several of the isles that Sharlayan kind of manages. So there's the Isle of Val, the Isle of Ham, the Isle of Yorn. We visited a couple of those areas in Endwalker during a couple of different dungeons, but yeah, the old world is kind of its own thing over there. They're not necessarily part of Eorzea or Ilsabard necessarily. So to understand Final Fantasy XIV and how the timeline works, we need to understand the difference between Umbral eras and Astral eras. So Umbral eras are periods of scarcity. This is kind of immediately after or like during a war when the nation is kind of like, or not the nation so much as the world is trying to more so rebuild itself. Umbral eras pretty much come directly after a calamity, and a calamity is when this major disaster happens. I'll go a little bit more into why calamities are a thing and what they all mean later, but typically Umbral eras come after a calamity. And then at some point during an Umbral era, we transition over into an Astral era, which is known as a period of abundance. So a couple of notable eras for us to talk about is the first Umbral era. So the first Umbral era is when the first brood arrived at Eorzea. So Midgardsormr, the Great Worm who gave birth to the first brood, he arrived on the planet Hydaelyn during the first Umbral era. During that time, there was also the war between the 5 wandering tribes. And also, I think before the first Umbral era was kind of known as like the Age of Gods. So that's when we kind of saw a lot of like the 12 coming up. The third Astral era, that was the creation of the Allagan Empire. So the Allagan Empire was a technologically and magically advanced society that ruled over pretty much all of Eorzea at the time. So during the third Astral era is also when the war with Mericidia actually started. And with that, the fall and imprisonment of Bahamut happened. So after an Astral era comes an Umbral era, and the fourth Umbral era had this huge earthquake that resulted in the fall of the Allagan Empire. A lot of things happened from the fall of the Allagans. We saw like a giant city called Azizla that was put into orbit, and we also saw the red moon Dalamud sent up into the sky. About 1,500 years ago was the Sixth Umbral Era. That's when the War of the Magi happened. That was between the cities of Amdapor and Mach. There was another one, another city in there, but I'm forgetting it at the moment. Oh, Nim. Amdapor and Nim versus Mach. And this war that was happening was resulting in so much aether being consumed and so much magic being thrown around that the elementals were angered. The elementals kind of residing in the Shroud. And a flood kind of went all across Eorzea. It eliminated many city-states and kind of created a lot of the topography in Eorzea that we know today. And around this time is when Sharlayan was actually established. Old Sharlayan specifically, because New Sharlayan actually was over more so in the area of Eorzea, close to Dravania. But this flood actually had them flee over to the Old World, as it's called. So let's talk about the Sixth Astral Era. A couple notable events pre 1.0. The beginning of the Dragon Song War. I think this was 200 years ago. This is essentially when the nation of Ishgard went up against Nidhogg and a lot of dragons. The Horde, as they call themselves. This is a war that continues on up until Heavensward. So this is a war that does go on for 2 centuries and is a really big part of Ishgard's history. There's also the founding of the Garlean Empire. The Garlean Empire haven't been around forever, but pretty much the Garlean Empire comes along, and they get some mysterious backing. Maybe it's Allegan ruins that they're finding, or maybe something else, but they seem to have more advanced weaponry and machinery. The Garleans do not have any affinity for magic. In fact, most Garleans actually cannot use magic. So they rely on magic tech, or a lot of different types of machina to boost their army. We also see Garlemald conquering Ilsebard and Othard. I think also Girabanya might be part of this too, because Girabanya is kind of like on the border of Ilsebard and Aldenard. But yeah, Garlemald's going to go in there. They're going to conquer places like Corvos. They're going to probably go over into Bosnia a bit, I think. Werlet for sure. And then kind of continue on into the Far East and take over Othard. As part of the Garleans' expansion, there was the fall of Midgardsormr. There was this giant cerulean ship that Garlemald was transporting, and the great worm Midgardsormr, angered probably by the Garleans taking up his skies, or because Garlemald was about to go wage war on Mericidia. Midgardsormr wrapped himself around the ship, and there was a huge explosion of ceruleum, killing Midgardsormr and sinking both the ship and Midgardsormr's corpse into Silvertear Lake, which is right by the Crystal Tower over in Mordona. Some time before 1.0, there was also the spread of the Echo. There were people that started getting this gift to be able to see into the past, or to break down barriers between people. And as part of this, these people started seeing visions that look much like what you're seeing on the screen right now, where they started seeing visions of like raining, falling stars. There was also the start of the Meteor Project, as well as some of the Meteor Project testing that resulted in, I think there was like, I forget the name of the place, but there was some fortress over in Bosnia that had catastrophic results because of the testing of this Meteor Project. But this Meteor Project was started by Nail Van Darnus, who we'll talk about briefly. But yeah, essentially we saw this red moon being brought down a little bit closer and closer. So talking about 1.0 real quick, couple notable events. This is if, like, you started up in 1.0, you would start as an adventurer that's working with the city-states to fend off primals. It's a very similar opening to what we saw in A Realm Reborn. We saw Nail Van Darnus build Castrum Novum in Mordona, and the purpose of this castrum, the purpose of this fortress, was to call down Dalamud. Whether it's magnets or something, I have no idea, but Nail had this vision that she wanted Dalamud to come down to Eorzea, and we actually find out later that Nail was kind of like spurred on by Ascians. So there's this kind of cult, or this group of people called the Ascians, and they're these robed, masked figures that have some type of puppetry that they're doing behind the scenes. So at this point, if you were playing 1.0, you would have a boss fight at a place called Riven Road, where you would defeat Nail, and you were like, oh, we stopped the Meteor Project. But despite us defeating Nail, Dalamud still continued to descend, and at the time, Garlemald was also attacking attacking the continent of Eorzea. So there was like an Eorzean alliance put together to defend the assault of Garlemald. But despite all that, Dalamud still descended, and there was a man from Sharlayan called Louis-Sois Leveilleux who was trying to stop it. And Louis-Sois had tons of disciples. He had the students of Aldesion. He had the Circle of the 12, which was another one of Louisoix's followings. And so Louisoix essentially tried to stop what was all happening. And this is where we go from the 6th Astral Era into the 7th Umbral Era, which means that a calamity happens. So Bahamut burst forth from Dalamud. It turns out that during the war against the Allagan Empire, Bahamut was imprisoned inside of Dalamud and sent up before the Allagan Empire fell. So his rage has just been kind of marinating inside of Dalamud for over a thousand years, I think. So, yeah, Dalamud comes down, Bahamut descends upon Eorzea and causes a lot of destruction. So Louisoix transforms into the Primal Phoenix and scatters Bahamut into pieces. Talking about primals real quick, because we'll mention them a lot. Primals are essentially these like deities that are either inspired by like these beings that existed in the past, or are completely dreamt up new ones, or are representations of ideas. So primals are typically summoned through the thoughts and prayers and sacrifice of others. And Louisoix transforming into Phoenix actually makes a lot of sense, because there was a lot of prayers, a lot of hope that the Eorzean Alliance would come back from the fight against Garlemald, and there was also a lot of sacrifice, which was the entire war that was happening underneath Dalamud. So Louisoix transforms into the Primal Phoenix and scatters Bahamut into several pieces. And after that, there's kind of this big time skip. So if you did play 1.0, your character would get transported 5 years forward in time. Over the next 5 years, we saw that Eorzea itself, because of Dalamud and Bahamut's destruction, Eorzea changed. Ancient structures started being unearthed, climates were shifting, nations were moving, and a lot of beast tribes a lot of people were kind of forced to move, forcing a lot of friction between city-states and beast tribes. But a lot of like the crystal structures that you see in Eorzea, a lot of those were caused by Bahamut's fury. Around this time too, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn are formed. During those 5 years, it was essentially a group that was dedicated to stopping primals. A lot of them were former disciples of Louisoix. Okay, so that's it for 1.0. I don't see any questions in chat, and I spent a little bit longer on there than I thought I would, so provided there aren't any questions, I'll keep moving forward. Alright. So first we're going to talk about a Realm Reborn. So a Realm Reborn, whether you were an adventurer that came over from 1.0 or a brand new adventurer starting out, you kind of start the same way. You see this vision of this mother crystal, Hydaelyn, and you're like, oh, it's this crystal, but we also are on the planet Hydaelyn, so is this like the will of the planet or something like that? And Hydaelyn grants the Warrior of Light, I will be referring to our characters as the Warrior of Light moving forward. Hydaelyn grants the Warrior of Light her Blessing of Light. A blessing and a gift called the Echo, which I mentioned earlier. It not only does it let you kind of see into the past and get a vision into who people are, but it also protects the bearer from tempering. Primals have this ability to temper people and bend them to their will. So people with the Blessing of Light or the Echo have kind of a defense shield against that tempering. So the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, trying to stop primals, disciples of Louisoix. So during this time, kind of the beginning of ARR, and a good chunk of ARR, the Warrior of Light is kind of, moving about. Whichever city-state you start at, you go and you meet all the different people at the different city-states, you kind of get to know their cultures and their leaders, and then you go off and you slay Ifrit and Titan. With the power of the Echo, you are immune to their tempering, and you become acquainted with the Scions as you do that. During this time, because of us being some kind of amazing primal slayer, the Warrior of Light hears about this Ascian known as La Habrea, and there's kind of a difference between La Habrea and this other Ascians, where La Habrea actually has this kind of red mask. As we're going about killing Titans, Livia Sans Eunice, who is one of the Garlean Empire's commanders, Livia raids the Waking Sands, the base of the Scions, and kills a lot of Scions. So this kind of shakes up the organization a good bit. The Warrior of Light then meets with Cid Garland. Cid Garland was a Garlean that joined Eorzean forces during the war against Eorzea. Using Cid's very strong capability with machinery and airships, we create an airship and go to slay Garuda. But after slaying Garuda, Gaius Van Balsar appears and shows up with this giant creature called the Ultimate Weapon. Or Ultima Weapon. Sorry, Ultima Weapon. So, Gaius appears and provokes both Titan, Ifrit, and Garuda, and then Ultimate Weapon just proceeds to absorb them. It defeats all of them, and actually seems to absorb some of the power from those primals. So, it turns out that the Ultima Weapon was a weapon created by the Alligans as this, like, primal slaying weapon. And so, yeah, we get to see some of that. We also get some inkling that the Ascians have been pulling some of the strings behind Garlemald's aggression. We also find out at this point that La Habrea can possess people. Ascians have the ability to possess others. So we see that La Habrea has possessed Thancred's body. So there's kind of this, like, if they're helping out the Garleans and they're also possessing somebody that's traveling with us, that creates a lot of issue. Thancred being one of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. So, we have the Ultima Weapon, we have this giant threat that needs to be stopped, and we know that we gotta stop it fast. So, the Warrior of Light, along with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn that are remaining, convinces the Eorzean Alliance, so that's the nations of Limsa Laminsa, Gridania, and Ul'dah, convinces the Eorzean Alliance to stand against Garlemald and launch Operation Archon, where there is an assault on Castrum Meridianum. So the Warrior of Light attacks Castrum Meridianum and slays Livia Sans Eunice, and also confronts Gaius and La Habrea. Using the light of the crystals that we've kind of found on our journey, we banish La Habrea from Thancred's body. So there's this blade of light that's kind of created by Hydaelyn that we use, and we kind of knock La Habrea out of there. So that kind of... and then after that, the leaders of the Eorzean Alliance declared the beginning of the 7th Astral Era. So we have been in the 7th Umbral Era for all of A Realm Reborn, and then once you get to the very end of 2.0, it is now the 7th Astral Era. So we're now kind of in this age of, like, prosperity, and we're not really worried about those calamities at this moment. So from there, it kind of takes a bit of a backseat until the patch. So during this point in time, there's, like, we kind of go around doing a bunch of, like, primal killing, right? So the Scions go around and deal with threats like Grey King Mughal, Ramu, Leviathan, and they kind of learn a little bit more about, like, the Ascians and other potential threats that could be coming up. But one of the primals that we learn about is Saint Shiva. Oh, also during this time, we kind of meet Elidibus, who is the emissary of the Ascians. And Elidibus is this Ascian with a white robe. And we kind of assume that Elidibus is kind of the leader of them. So that happens before we meet Lady Iceheart. So as we're kind of going around hearing about primals and addressing those issues, we hear about this person that's trying to summon the primal Shiva. And we meet Lady Iceheart, who wants to summon Shiva to end the Dragon Song War. See, Shiva was actually a human that fell in love with the dragon. And the hope is that if we can get this person who kind of, like, united the worlds of people and dragon, that Shiva can help to end the Dragon Song War. The Warrior of Light also, with all this talk going around about the Dragon Song War and Shiva being awakened, meets up with Midgardsormr, who joins the Warrior of Light after removing the Blessing of Light from us. So now we're vulnerable to primals, I guess. I don't know why you did that, but maybe to test us. But yeah, we meet with Midgardsormr. Turns out he's still alive, or at the very least, his body is dead, but his spirit is still very much alive. So he kind of creates like a Drake, like a small miniature version of himself, and kind of starts to follow us around. I don't know. I don't think I have a slide for this. I don't. Okay. Also, the Scions are attacked by an Ascian, Nabrialis, who we actually figure out how to defeat an Ascian using White Auracite, because it turns out that because Ascians are just possessing people, it turns out that you can't really just kill them. If you slay the body that they're in, the Ascian returns to the Rift and just kind of chills there until they possess a new body. So we found out that using White Auracite, which is a stone that can trap a vast amount of ether, we can actually trap the ether of those Ascians and kill them. So that was a really big deal at that time. Also, as part of the Dragonsong War, we kind of got involved in Kurthus a little bit during the base game of A Realm Reborn, and we go to fend off Nidhogg's champion at the Steps of Faith. So we're kind of getting a little bit more and more involved with Ishgard, and now they're actually kind of asking us to kind of come and help them out. But before I go into Heavensward stuff, which I'll take questions, I'll go through any questions right before I start talking Heavensward, but I want to talk about the Crystal Tower real quick, because the Crystal Tower does come into play later. So, Crystal Tower, Sid Garland joins an organization to study the Crystal Tower. And after forming the coalition with Noah, the Warrior of Light meets Grahatia. Grahatia is a boy from Sharlayan with some Allagan ancestry that can help us to investigate the tower a little bit, because it turns out a lot of the Allagan technology relies on Allagan blood to access it. So while exploring the Crystal Tower, the Warrior of Light actually fights the awakened Emperor Zonde, who was put into kind of like a time freeze sort of situation. And we find out that the Allagan Empire actually fell because Zonde was trying to summon Voidsent from the Void. And we actually need to go stop the Cloud of Darkness, who is this giant Voidsent. So we chase the Cloud of Darkness into the Void. So, talking real quick about the Void, it's pretty much this world that has been completely surrounded by darkness. And there are different kind of like demonic entities called Voidsent that come from the Void. Those can be portals that people decide to open up, or people can offer up like vessels to Voidsent, and Voidsent will send their aether across dimensions, essentially, and possess those vessels. But yeah, so we chase the Cloud of Darkness into the Void. Then, gaining control over the tower using his Allagan blood, Grahatia seals himself inside of the tower, determining that Eorzea isn't quite ready for the technology of the Allagans. And so once their technology kind of gets up to that point, then Grahatia is ready to kind of unveil the secrets and mysteries of the tower. I guess I kind of spoiled that there, but so after all this stuff, the Scions are invited to a banquet where we're kind of celebrating the Eorzean alliance and the victory that they had over like Nidhogg's champion and over Garlemald. So celebrating a banquet, and the Sultana calls us up to her chambers. While we're in there, she is assassinated. She takes a sip from a cup and falls over, clearly poisoned. And it turns out that there's this grand scheme going on in the background where the Scions have been framed for the assassination of the Sultana. So the Warrior of Light, Alphino, and Tataru escape, and during all this, like, there's this Lalafell in the Ul'dah Syndicate, Lolarito, begins kind of, like, covering up all these events. It's this really big, like, government scheme. So as fugitives from Ul'dah, and presumably from the Eorzean Alliance, the three Scions set off for Ishgard, looking for refuge. Because at this point, they're the only nation that, you know, isn't out for us because of this assassination. So, that's a Realm Reborn. A Realm Reborn really is about world building and about setting a lot of the it's about setting a lot of like the rules for the world and who's who. And yeah, a lot of people skip it. There is kind of a lot of stuff in there that like is very slow, but it has a really cool payoff at the end with that banquet. The cutscene itself is really long, but like it's pretty well set. Okay, so I'll take any questions before we get into Heavensward. Welcome to all the first-time chatters in here. Glad you guys are here. I see a question in there. What are the primal crystals? So I know there are these like crystals that are happening. There are these crystals that we kind of like pick up as we're going about slaying primals at the beginning of a Realm Reborn. I don't quite know. There's this, like, I guess there are these concentrations of ether, but they have some tie to Hydaelyn, because we actually use those crystals to kind of make the Blade of Light that we use to initially banish La Habrea from Thancred's body. So I'm not sure if those crystals are, like, they have some tie to Hydaelyn. But it's been a while since I looked in those. Why did we kill Xande again? Okay, so the reason that we kill Xande in the Crystal Tower... So, Xande was actually this, like, overlord, essentially. So, during the Third Astral Era, when the Allagan Empire was, ruling Eorzea, he's essentially Alexander the Great. Like, his whole deal is that he wants to conquer more and more and more of the world. And the Allagan Empire actually had the resources and technology to do that. So he's like, all right, we're going to conquer the world, And then, at some point, he starts relying on the Void. He finds out about the Void, and he's like, hey, I want the power of this Void Scent to help me in my conquest. And I think he also was being kind of a little bit egged on by the Cloud of Darkness, who is this, like, giant Void Scent. So, yeah, essentially... we wanted to kill Xande because as soon as he came out of, like, his time paralysis, he's like, yo, I'm gonna conquer the world. And we're like, don't do that. And then, the Crystal Tower was essentially built to access the Void. That's the reason the Crystal Tower is there. Xande built this tower to kind of pierce dimensions, essentially. And that's, because he needed to create a Void Gate that was big enough for the Cloud of Darkness. Because Voidsent just can't jump over into our world whenever they want. They need Void Gates in order to do it. And a Voidsent can only fit through a Void Gate that's as big as the Voidsent is. So the Cloud of Darkness is this huge, gigantic, powerful Voidsent. And the Crystal Tower is one of the only things that's capable of opening up a Void Gate that big. Can we watch the Heavensward trailer on stream? I can... That's not a bad idea to watch, like, some of the trailers ahead of time. I don't have them prepared, though. And I have the stream set up pretty specific here. So, well, also for the sake of time, because I think the trailers alone would add, like, 30 minutes onto the presentation or something like that. So... The Dragoon Glove. I think I have... Maybe I don't have that in the slideshow, but I think for the time being, we'll move on. But I'll have to keep that in mind for the next one. That's a solid idea. Okay, if there are no more questions, then I think it's time to move over into Heavensward. So, we move into Ishgard, the nation of Ishgard, right? So the remaining Scions are taken in by House Fortomp of Ishgard. And so, like, there's this dude, Harshavon, right? You may have heard of him. Harshavon has kind of been, like, our main contact between us and Ishgard during the events of A Realm Reborn. And Harshavon kind of agrees with, like, the idea of an Eorzean alliance, and he really wants Ishgard to be a part of that alliance. Unfortunately, Ishgard, being an extremely pious and kind of solidary nation wants nothing to do with that. So Harshavan's kind of our boy. He's been helping us through a lot, and he was at his house that kind of like took us in at the beginning of Heavensward. So we kind of go into Ishgard, we learn a lot about the culture, and then we kind of step out for a little bit, and it's actually revealed that the Sultana was not assassinated, but instead just put to sleep with a drink in an effort to reveal the corruption in Uldah's syndicate. I don't have any points about that on the slide. It's just kind of like she was just taking a little bit of a nap. So, that plot doesn't really end up going too much of anywhere other than exposing Lola Brito and a lot of the other corrupt members of the syndicate. And so some agreements were kind of worked out there. So, after we go back to Ishgard, we are then introduced to Estinian, the Azure Dragoon, pretty much one of the champions of the Dragoons in Ishgard. And so we work with Estinian and Lady Iceheart, who is, her name is Ysael, and we kind of work with them to figure out how to bring about a peace between dragons. Bringing about peace is probably more likely with Hraesvelgr. So Nidhogg, the dragon on the left, is the dragon that kind of has been leading this whole war. He has a deep hatred for what he describes as lesser races. And Hraesvelgr is his brother, so both of them are actually children of the First Brood, which are children of the Great Worm Midgardsormr. So we find that, okay, Hraesvelgr has been chill, and that's actually the dragon that Saint Shiva fell in love with. So we're kind of hoping that he might be the bridge between peace and war. I went a little bit ahead there, but it's fine. As we're kind of going about making our way over to Hraesvelgr, we do stop the primals Ravana and Bismarck. These are kind of primals that, if they were actually summoned by their beast tribes, it would kind of risk getting like a third faction involved in the war. Oh, whoops. We'll talk about that in a bit. So anyways, the Warrior of Light and Estinian find and kill Nidhogg in the area, and also talk with Hraesvelgr. Hraesvelgr kind of reveals that King Thordan I and his knights slew the sister of Hraesvelgr and Nidhogg, and tore out her eyes to give Ishgard draconic power, which is how the Knights of the Round are kind of like all built up. So Hraesvelgr kind of reveals some of those truths, and those truths start to cause some riots. And the current Archbishop of Ishgard, Archbishop Thordan VII, they don't like that. So him and his knights flee for Azizla to become primals, and they want to permanently end the war by wiping out all of dragonkind. Before they flee, though, they imprison Amaric in the vault, where we confront him and free Amaric. But Harshavan, shielding us from a spear of light, dies trying to protect us. So, Harshavan kind of dies bleeding out on the ground, and he tells us, a smile better suits a hero, as you guys in the chat are quoting. But yeah, kind of spurred on by Harshavan's death, we pursue Archbishop Thordan VII to Azizla. I keep advancing too many points ahead here, but it's fine. So we confront Thordan and Azizla, and we defeat him. But once we defeat him, actually, going back real quick, as we kind of make our way up to Azizla, in an effort to defend us from Thordan's forces, Ysael is actually killed. She turns into Shiva and sacrifices herself for us. Then we get to Azizla, and we actually fight Lahabrea and Igiorum, two Asians who kind of like fuse together, and we actually do kill them with white Auracite. But before they die, they kind of speak of wanting to... maybe it was fighting Garleans. You might be right there. But, oh yeah, because Garlemald is kind of like coming to Azizla at the same time. So in an effort to make sure that we're not fighting both Thordan and Garlemald, Ysael kind of intercepts like the Garlean airships. Yeah, so right before La Habrea and Igiorim die, they say something about wanting to resurrect Lord Zodiark. So we don't quite know what that means. We have no idea who Zodiark is, but we get the idea that that's kind of what all of the Ascians want. So, had to backtrack a little bit there. But we get to Azizla, we kill Thordan, and after his defeat, Estinian gets both of Nidhogg's eyes now from Thordan, because Thordan had one of the eyes, Estinian had the other, and that causes Estinian to get a little bit possessed. So, with both eyes in his hands, it turns out that a dragon's essence and spirit are closely tied to the eyes. So Nidhogg pretty much completely takes over Estinian. Where Estinian says that he will be the one to end the Dragon Song War and wipe out Ishgard because he's now taken over by Nidhogg. So we kind of go back. This is at the very end of 3.0, so very end of the launch of Heavensward. We go back, but we kind of like, all right, we don't know what we're going to do about Estinian, but the Dragon Song War is at the very least kind of put on halt for a little bit. And we realize, Ishgar's like, hey, we need help. And it turns out that the Warrior of Light was a big help. Maybe outsiders aren't so bad. So Ishgard opens itself up to other nations and actually becomes a member of the Eorzean Alliance. So, the Warrior of Light then goes out to find the missing scions, because there are still a couple of scions that went missing after the banquet. During that time, the Warrior of Light encounters the Warriors of Darkness, where we learn that they are from a place called the First. So it's revealed that Zodiark was cast out by Hydaelyn, and in doing so, shattered the world into 14 incarnations. Essentially think of them as like parallel universes, but like they kind of are a good bit different from ours. So we currently live on the Source, which is where Hydaelyn is. So there is the Source and then 13 reflections of that Source. So we find out that these Warriors of Darkness are actually from the First. So there's like the first, the second, the third for each of the shards of Hydaelyn. So we learned that the Warriors of Darkness come from the First, a land that was kind of overrun by light. And we also learned that the goal of the Ascians is to collapse each of those shards back into the Source. And what they want to do is, after all the shards are collapsed back into the Source, it will fully resurrect their god Zodiark, who is trapped on the moon. So far, there have been 7 rejoinings. So there have been 7 shards that have been collapsed back into the Source. In order to make any of those happen, there has to be a calamity. So we don't want that. But yeah, essentially the First, where the Warriors of Darkness come from, was consumed by a flood of light that happened after the Warriors of Darkness defeated kind of all the Ascians over there, and there was an imbalance of light and darkness. So we kind of encounter the Warriors of Darkness, tussle with them for a bit, and then kind of go our own way, because they have their own mission, and we find out that Nidhogg is attacking Ishgard. Nidhogg interrupts a peace conference in Ishgard, declaring that war is about to end, and actually impales one of the dragons that is trying to broker the peace. So aided by Hraesvelgr, we face off against Nidhogg at the final steps of faith. And, we free Estinian from Nidhogg's grasp. And we also toss Nidhogg's eyes into like this big valley or whatever, this bottomless pit, I guess. That certainly won't come back to bite the Warrior of Light anytime soon, but that's what we do. The Warriors of Darkness then retrieve those eyes. And if we find out that they're working with the leader of the Asians, Elidibus, who would be the person on the left of that screenshot there. I believe it's La Habrea on the right. So, they retrieve the eyes, we kind of learn all that stuff I was saying about the first, and Minfilia, who is kind of the leader of the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, turns out she has a pretty deep connection with Hydaelyn, as the word of the mother. So she kind of has like the ability to hear and see kind of what Hydaelyn's thinking a bit. So she travels with the Warriors of Darkness to their home, and she stops the Flood of Light. We don't exactly see how all of that happens. We just know that she travels over to the first, and she stops the Flood of Light, and we don't know what happens after that, at this point in the story. So that kind of wraps up all the stuff with like the Warriors of Darkness. So, also fun fact, the Warrior of Darkness, who is kind of like the main guy there at the bottom left, well, the left screenshot in the very center at the bottom. Yeah, he does look a lot like the guy from the cinematic trailers. So, with Nidhogg defeated, essentially, the Dragonsong War is over. It's officially declared to be over, and there is peace being made between dragons and Ishgard. So we kind of get to move away from that a little bit at a very convenient time, because we hear of an Alamegan resistance group led by the Griffin. And it seems like the Griffin's goal is to summon this primal to fight against Garlemald. And just for some context, Alamigo is an area that's like pretty close to Ul'dah, over in like Girabanya, and they were taken over by the Garlean Empire not that long before a Realm Reborn. So I think it happened really close to it, actually, because a lot of the people in Alamigo can remember what it was like before Garlemald took over. So maybe it was like 10 years or something like that. I can't quite remember off the top of my head, but so the Griffin, who turns out to be a traitor who was involved around like the banquet schemes, it's Ildbird. He reveals his plan, and it's to create this perfect situation to summon a primal that's even mightier than Bahamut, the primal Shinryu. So using the Eyes of Nidhogg, that he also got somehow, using the Eyes of Nidhogg and using the lore, much like what happened at Cartano to summon Bahamut, the Griffin sacrifices himself, and using the Aether of the Two Eyes summons the primal Shinryu. However, knowing this primal was about to be summoned, the Scions went in advance and found an ancient Allagan weapon called Omega Weapon, and set it loose on Shinryu. Omega was actually the weapon that the Allagan Empire used to imprison Bahamut back during the war between the Allagans and the Mericidian Horde. So Shinryu and Omega fly over into Girabanya, kind of like crash over there, and the Eorzean Lions take back Baelsar's wall, and asks the Scions to kind of help with the Alamegan resistance. It's like, hey, you guys are Primal Slayers, Shinryu's over in Girabanya, Alamigo's over there, like, is there anything you guys can look into while you're over there? And that kind of takes us directly into Stormblood. So, that wraps up the stuff for Heavensward. A lot of people really fondly remember the story of Heavensward because, I mean, the death scene with Harshivan is like a really big deal. But also, I saw it in chat earlier, I think it was kind of cool that they ended off the story in Heavensward with kind of this like twist that like Estinian's been possessed by Nidhogg. And what happens in like when you fight Nidhogg at the final steps of Faith is a really cool like final battle that really has a good like bookend for the end of the Dragonsong War. So it's a really cool part of the story for sure. And the stuff with like the Warriors of Darkness, some of that world building that happens, it's really cool. I don't think I saw. Any questions? Yeah, we did see the Emperor guy in Heavensward. That's Varus. I think Varus von Galvus. We'll talk about him a good bit towards the end of Stormblood here. What was the deal with Az's Law? Okay, a couple questions coming in here. So, question, what was the deal with Az's Law? I forgot why it was important. So, Az's Law was kind of this, like, giant research facility that was created by the Allegan Empire. And actually, like, right before the Allegan Empire fell during the Third Astral Era, they, like, kind of sent all of that up into the sky. It's also important to note that the Warring Triad, so what is that? That's Sephiroth, Zervan, and I can never remember who the other one is. But the Warring Triad was actually also imprisoned in that sanctuary. Also, they imprisoned Tiamat, who, like, that was its own crazy thing. So, yeah. So Az's Law was kind of like this big prison and research facility for the Allegan Empire. And the reason that Thordan wanted to go there is because I believe they had the sword Ascalon there. And I think the sword Ascalon was used alongside the Eyes of Nidhogg to kind of like turn them into the primals, the Knights of the Round. I'm pretty sure that's what it was, because I know Ascalon was like a pretty big deal. Trying to figure out. I'm pretty sure Ascalon was also in the Ethereal Chemical Research Facility, and so that maybe had like the primal, like the Knights of the Round in there, and so that combined with the Eyes of Nidhogg, which answering your question, Apple, pretty much combining the thoughts and prayers that went into the Sword of Ascalon, along with the Aether and Rage of Nidhogg's eyes. That's kind of how, like, the primals were kind of brought about. Because they already had, like, the Knights of the Round already had, like, some transforming power because they were using Nidhogg's eyes to kind of, like, turn into primals themselves. But I think Nidhogg became the Thordan primal with the Ascalon sword. Why is Estinian so cool? Because Estinian's so cool because part of his design is that his armor gets colored red because it's soaked in the blood of Nidhogg. That's why he's cool. Like, that's sick, man. That's such a cool design. It just stains his armor. His armor's just stained red because he got soaked in blood. Okay. I think that's all the questions then. So we'll move over into Stormblood. All right, Stormblood. Let's get into this then. Also, I saw someone say I'm already at the Steps of Faith. Dude, it's been like 54 minutes. And I've got 3 more expansions to go. Like, and they get longer with each expansion. I gotta blaze through it, you know? Alright. So, the Resistance. The Scions arrive in Alamigo, and they set up, you know, they work with this Alamigan base at this place called Rogger's Reach. And the Scions kind of help with a variety of, like, sting operations around the area to kind of increase the foothold of the Resistance. So, Rogger's Reach, that's kind of where the base of operation is for Alamegans. It's pretty close to, like, I think it's, like, through the Shroud, maybe? Because you come out through the woods, but anyways. Well, the Alamegan, as we're going about doing sting operations, the Resistance headquarters gets raided by the Imperial Viceroy, Xenos Ye Galvis, who defeats the Warrior of Light in combat. So Xenos is actually the son of the Emperor of Garlemald, who is Varys Galvis. So at this point, the Scions are like, alright, we're kind of like spread out in Alamigo, and we don't know what to do against the Garlean Empire, so let's try to spread the Garleans thin. Let's try to fight a war on two fronts. Because keep in mind, right, Alamigo is like right on the border of Aldenard and Ilsabard, and then Authard is all the way to the far east, right? So if we can get the Garleans spread out between those two, maybe we have a better chance, right? So we decide to fight a war on two fronts. We travel from Alamigo by boat, going over into Authard, with the goal of taking back Doma. So, the Scions try to, meet with the Domans, and they encounter a beast tribe that summons their primal Susano. This is not Susano. I want to slide ahead. It's fine. But yeah, so we're kind of like crossing the Ruby Sea to get over to Dona. So we arrive in Kugane, cross the Ruby Sea, encounter this primal Susano, and then we arrive at Doma. And we are looking for Hien. Hien is the heir to the Doman throne, and we kind of want him to like lead the resistance, because hopefully he will instill hope in the Domans. Because like I said earlier, the Domans can remember that they were free at one point, and they just feel like the Garlean Empire is this unbeatable force. So maybe instilling some hope in them with someone like Hien will help to inspire the civilians to kind of help rise up with the resistance. So with Hien's help, the resistance raids Doma Castle and defeats Yotsuyu, who is the acting Imperial Viceroy. So Yotsuyu is kind of an example of some of the tragedy that happens in this war with Garlemald. Yotsu was originally sold off to like an abusive husband, and when her abusive husband died, she was then sold off to a brothel. And eventually it was kind of, like, out of rage, became a spy for the Empire in order to get back at her own people, essentially. And through that, she started to gain the favor of Xenos, and that's how she became the acting Viceroy. But we defeat her, and we free the Doman Castle. We free the Domans of Garlean rule. So at this point, Doma has been liberated from Garlemald. However, as with anything else, meanwhile, primal summoning. So back at Girabanya, there has been a beast tribe whose ruler was taken as a causality of war. And the tribe responds by summoning a primal Sri Lakshmi. Anyways, back at Alamigo now, we are kind of pushing in on Garlemald, and we confront Xenos, who transforms into Shinryu. So we fight Shinryu, and it's this battle, and at this point, Xenos has taken a great interest in us, the Warrior of Light. Xenos goes as far as to say that we are his nemesis and his only real friend. Xenos is this bloodthirsty man who only wants to fight somebody that can give him a challenge, and we were one of the first people to do so. So Xenos very much is interested in who we are and what we do, so to create this grand battle, he transforms into this massive dragon, and we defeat him. So finally facing a challenge, he kills himself. He smiles at us, calls us his only friend, and slits his throat. So this essentially ends the war between Garlemald and Girabanya, or Garlemald and Alamigo, and also we freed the Domans. So a lot has gotten done, which is great. So at this point, Old Dog kind of considers how to best help Alamigo with rebuilding and transitioning refugees. But at the same time, an amnesiac Yotsuyu appears, and Doma decides to kind of like hold on to her almost as like a prisoner of war. She can't remember anything, but we're kind of hoping this can be used as some leverage to have a prisoner exchange with prisoners that Garlemald has taken from both Doma and Garabanya in exchange for Yotsuyu. So, her stepbrother, Asahi, proposes, this prisoner exchange. Provoked by Asahi, Yotsuyu regains her memories and transforms into the primal Tsukiyomi. We fight Tsukiyomi and stop her from letting her rage and sorrow kind of like consume her and become this destructive primal. But right before she dies, she impales Asahi. Turns out that, she didn't really have a great relationship with anybody in her life. So, yeah. Once she saw that Asahi was just using her as a means to an end, she impaled him before she died. Shortly before Asahi goes away, though, we see a vision of Asahi meeting with Xenos. So we see the body of Xenos, and he is talking with Asahi, and it seemed like he was actually orchestrating Tsukiyomi becoming a primal. So once again, there's a lot of things being pulled behind a lot of strings being pulled behind the scenes here. So the thing is, we buried Xenos. We actually buried Xenos' body, so we kind of start to suspect Asian involvement. And we discover that Xenos is actually Elidibus, the white-robed Asian who is possessing the body of Xenos. Turns out, though, Xenos has a little bit of body-hopping abilities. So it turns out the real Xenos is possessing some random Garlean soldier. So there's all this stuff kind of going on in the background. So during all of this, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn kind of start to enter this comatose state one by one. And there's this voice inside of the Warrior of Light's ear, throw wide the gates. We keep on hearing this, with kind of this idea that, like, at some point the Warrior of Light is going to be the next person to just drop and go into this comatose state. We saw him in Heavensward, but again, we get to meet with the leader of the Garlean Empire, Varys. Now, Varys, while he's in Garlemald, is confronted by an Asian that is using the body of Garlemald's founder, Solus von Galvis. And this Asian, who is going around in Solus's body, reveals the true origin of the Garlean Empire. It turns out that the Garlean Empire was actually created by an Asian for the purpose of being used to start another calamity, to start another rejoining. So the Asians are pulling a lot of strings here. They are manipulating a lot of events, all for these rejoinings. So as the Scions are kind of going around seeing how the Asians are trying to create this 8th rejoining, the Asians meet with the Scions meet with an Asian hunter, the Shadow Hunter, who is actually Gaius von Belsar. Turns out that after we defeated him in the Praetorium, he defected from the Empire, and he started to kind of warn the Scions, like, hey, there's this calamity that Garlemald's trying to cause using a gas called the Black Rose, which is this, like, gas that could just instantly take out thousands of people in the blink of an eye. So, the Eorzean Alliance meets with Emperor Varys, who's like, dude, you want to conquer us, right? You don't want to kill us. What is the deal? Turns out that Varys is siding with the Asians, believing that we should actually help the Asians with the rejoinings. So we need to cause calamities, which is why they're working on this Black Rose substance. Now, the reason he's doing this, albeit misguided, is because he believes that we have no chance against the Asians unless we are rejoined, unless all the shards are rejoined back into one. And I think he says the only way to stand against the Ascians is if we are one pure people. So this disagreement leads to an open war, with the Warrior of Light facing off against Elidibus. Elidibus using Xenos' body, right? So it's like Warrior of Light versus Xenos. It's technically Elidibus. Right before we're about to make kind of the final blow, the Warrior of Light hears the voice again, beckoning them to the Crystal Tower. The Warrior of Light kind of like passes out and then just wakes up in a bed, and we don't really have much else to do but to follow the voice, because we're hoping that following this voice will let us know what's happening to the other Scions of the Seventh Dawn who have also passed out. So, that is Stormblood. Yeah, Stormblood was very much like, there's a lot of politics in Stormblood, a lot of like figuring out like relationships between nations, and it's about like kind of instilling hope into people that have had that taken away from them, and how can you kind of like trust in somebody again after that hope's been ripped away from you. And I think Yotsuyu, you know, even though she wasn't technically like the main villain of the expansion, I think she does kind of embody that like person who has nothing left to lose anymore, but still wants there to be something to have hope in, but she just can't find it. Which I guess makes sense with Xenos, who is this like unstoppable, relentless embodiment of like destruction, right? But yeah, that was Stormblood. I think I breezed through this one the most out of all the expansions, because in terms of like major events, it's pretty segmented, and a lot of the stuff that's happening is like some of the intricacies between the characters and like their alliance to different nations. So any questions about Stormblood before I move on to Shadowbringers? Oh, I forgot about the lore whiz, Shirokuchiki. Yeah, I forgot about that. I'll be sure to put that in the presentation for next time. Okay. Doesn't sound like we have any questions for Stormblood, so we'll move over into Shadowbringers. All right. So, Shadowbringers, you know, we kind of start this expansion off by going to the Crystal Tower, following the voice that beckons us there. Once the Warrior of Light goes to the Crystal Tower, turns out the Warrior of Light gets teleported over to the First, the place where the Warriors of Darkness came from. We meet with this person called the Crystal Tower. We meet with this person at the Exarch. Turns out the First has a Crystal Tower of their own. So we meet with the Crystal Exarch, and he explains to us kind of the state of the First. The First has almost got consumed by a flood of darkness, but it turns out Minfilia was successful in stopping that flood of darkness. But that doesn't mean that there's not an imbalance between there's not an imbalance of light in the First. So when we go to the First, we see that the sky is always just light. It's just pure light. There is no night sky that happens in this world. And much like the Void, if we remember the Void, actually, let's talk about that real quick. So when we went to the Void back in the Crystal Tower, we actually learned later that that's not just the Void, where Void Center from, but that's actually the 13th. So it's one of the shards that was split off of Hydaelyn. Now, the 13th was a world that was consumed by a flood of darkness. It turns out that the Ascians attempted to rejoin the 13th a while ago, but were unsuccessful in doing so. So they've kind of just left the world in this dark, corrupted state, and that's what the Void is. So actually, when we traveled to the Void back in our Realm Reborn, that was our first instance of, like, hopping between the shards in Final Fantasy XIV, which is really cool. So the first is kind of like the opposite of the 13th. The 13th was consumed by a flood of darkness. The first was almost consumed by a flood of light. The 13th is the Aether of the people of the 13th had an imbalance, kind of leaning towards darkness, so they turned into Void Scent. Some people of the first that have an imbalance towards light become Sin Eaters. It's also worth noting that time progresses a little bit differently in the first compared to the source, where we're from. So, while it may have been a couple days on the source, it's actually been several years on the first. Now, talking a little bit more about the shards, let's talk about calamities, right? So each shard is aspected to a certain type of ether. You know, earth, fire, water, light, dark. Calamities are caused by an abundance of that single elemental ether, and if there is an imbalance in the source and an imbalance in one of the shards, a crack is created between those worlds, and that's what causes a rejoining. So, learning about the world of the first, and learning that there is these big, giant beings of light that are kind of like holding in a bunch of light, we meet up with the Scions and hunt down Light Wardens to bring back the night. So as we slay these Light Wardens, their hold over the land is released, and darkness is brought back into the sky. And we kind of start to get this name on the first. We're no longer the Warrior of Light, we're actually a Warrior of Darkness. During this, the Warrior, called the Warrior of Darkness, the Warrior of Darkness is visited by this specter of Ardbert. So this is actually the guy that we met back in Heavensward, one of the Warriors of Darkness. Turns out, when we sent the Warriors of Darkness back to the first, they didn't quite make it. They tried to last against, you know, the repercussions of the Flood of Light, but some of the Sin Eaters were too much for them. So Ardbert and his kind of team, his Warriors of Darkness, all fell to the harsh nature of the first. But it turns out that while nobody else can see Ardbert, we can. We can see Ardbert. So he's kind of like this ghost specter sort of thing. We also find a reincarnation of Minfilia. So it turns out that Minfilia stopped the Flood of Light and was reincarnated, and her reincarnations kind of have some powers of light themselves. At one point, the nation of Yulmore picked up on this, and because Yulmore is using Sin Eaters for their own gain, they kind of want this Oracle of Light to be not doing anything to stop their plans. So Minfilia has been imprisoned over at Yulmore, but turns out our boy Thancred has broken her out of Yulmore. So we meet up with those two and head over to Ilmeg to track down one of the remaining Light Wardens, who is Titania. So we take down Titania and return the Night Sky back to Ilmeg. We also do the same at the Ratika Greatwood as well. So, along the way, we meet Emmett Selk. So this is the guy that showed up to Solus Van this is the guy who was impersonating as Solus Van Galvis. This is the guy who's kind of like using the body of the founder of the Garlean Empire. He's the guy that appeared to Varys. So, turns out this is the actual Ascian that founded the Garlean Empire. Turns out Solus Zosgalvis was actually Emmett Selk. So Emmett Selk, this Ascian, gave birth, essentially, to the Garlean nation. But his whole deal now is, he's like, you know what? You Scions have actually been successful. in tipping the balance in your favor. So he's like, I want to try a new method. I want to try cooperation. So he's looking to kind of understand us and why we are doing the things that we do. What is motivating us to stop the Ascians? And he said all he asks for in turn is that the Scions listen to him when he explains why the Ascians are doing what they are doing. So through our adventures, Emet-Selch reveals the truth of Hydaelyn and Zodiark. So, a long, long time ago, before the first Umbral era, the world was once whole. But a calamity came about. The end days. The final days. Because of that, the Ascians, we'll call them the Ancients moving forward. We'll call them the Ancients in this context, when the world was all together, when the world was unsundered. To combat the final days, the Ancients sacrificed themselves to bring about this Zodiark. Zodiark was brought about by prayer and sacrifice. So, Zodiark came about, and in response to that, other Ancients summoned Hydaelyn. So Hydaelyn and Zodiark were both created by this ancient race of people, right? And Hydaelyn was kind of sent in to keep, like, shackles on Zodiark, right? Well, in the event where Hydaelyn and Zodiark fought, the final blow that Hydaelyn struck caused the sundering, which is the world splitting into, 14 versions. So Zodiark was created to prevent a calamity. Hydaelyn was created in response. They fought, and then the world split. And it's important to note that the world wasn't just split, but the people of it were also split, meaning that everyone became 1/14 of who they originally were. 1/14 of their strength, 1/14 of their ether, 1/14 of their intelligence, 1/14 of their soul. Only 3 Ascians survived the sundering. Emet-Selch, Lahabrea, and Elidibus. Those are the only 3 Ascians. The rest of the Ascians that we see were Ascians that the 3 unsundered Ascians gave them former memories and reminded them who they once were, and had them join their organization. So that's kind of like where Emmett says, like, hey dude, all I'm trying to do with the rejoining is to bring back my people. So Emmett wants us to understand, like, if you were in our shoes, if you were in my shoes, would you not try to bring back your own people? And that's the question that he poses to the Warrior of Light. So, after that huge plot dump, the Warrior of Light moves back to Yulmore and confronts and defeats the leader of Yulmore, Vothri, who turns out is also the final Light Warden, Innocence. Now, the thing that's been happening as we've been traveling around is as we defeat a Light Warden, we kind of absorb some of their light. The light has to go somewhere, so it seems that it's been going to us. Maybe that's because we're not completely imbalanced with light, so we attract it. But after absorbing too much light from the Wardens, the Warrior of Light is almost saved by the Crystal Exarch, who reveals himself to be Grahatia. But he is then stopped by Emet-Selch, who goads the Warrior of Light to meet him at the Tempest. So the Warrior of Light is currently suffering from this abundance of ether and is in danger of turning to a Sin Eater at any moment. So Emet-Selch says, hey, if you want your graveyard to be somewhere sick, come over to the Tempest. Talking about Graha real quick. So Grahatia's whole deal, if you remember in the Crystal Tower, Grahatia joined us for that, and he sealed himself inside of the tower. The Grahatia that we're talking to in the first actually is from the future of the source. Remember, time flows differently between the two worlds. So, using the Crystal Tower and a little bit of time travel, Grahatia traveled to the first. So what happened in the future is that Garlemald was actually successful in the 8th Calamity, and essentially wiped out all of the Scions, wiped out several of the city-states. In order to prevent that, G'rahatia kind of travels a little bit back into the past and goes over to the first in order to set up this master plan to help and prevent the calamity from happening. Because remember, the Crystal Tower has the power to kind of create a rift between the dimensions, as we saw with how it contacted the Cloud of Darkness with Emperor Xande. So, we kind of go back, Warrior of Light kind of goes back, collects their bearings, and then goes to the Tempest. And at the Tempest, we see this almost simulation of a lost Allagan civilization, Amarant, kind of the capital of the civilizations when the world was once whole. Turns out, we see that the ancients of that time had these extremely powerful creation magics. And we meet this one particular shade called Hythlodaeus. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that everything that we see at Amarant is kind of a simulation created by Emet-Selch, but the Ascians, or the Ancients rather, have ways of preserving memories, and then kind of like replaying those memories, or even letting those memories kind of live on as kind of a shade, like a husk with memories sort of thing. So Hythlodaeus reveals a little bit more about the Hydaelyn Zodiarch situation. It turns out that when the final days were happening, back in the ancient times, in order to summon Zodiarch, half of the civilization needed to give up their lives to summon Zodiarch. And then after that, another half gave up their lives to keep him there. The goal being to keep Zodiarch alive long enough to generate enough life on the planet to summon all of the new life to bring back all of the lives that were lost. With all of this death and all this sacrifice that's needed, there were a number of ancients that disagreed with this. So they summoned Hydaelyn in order to combat Zodiarch and stop this plan of more sacrifice. So, again, I went over this earlier. Emet-Selch kind of, again, talks to us about the idea of rejoining. And so the Warrior of Light goes to fight Emet-Selch. During this point, the Warrior of Light kind of, like, borrows strength from Ardbert. And Hythlodaeus actually reveals to us that we and Ardbert were once one being. So we can kind of trace everybody back to, like, who they were when the world was once unsundered. And it turns out that we and Ardbert were once the same person. So that probably explains why we're able to see him, and that also explains why we're able to borrow some of Ardbert's power to defeat Emet-Selch. Whose true form is Hades. So we defeat Emet-Selch, and we get a final request from him, where Emet-Selch says, remember us, remember that we once lived. Emet-Selch's whole motivation was just for his people to not become a distant memory, and he imparts that onto us before passing. Meanwhile, Xenos, who, if you remember, was possessing a Garlean soldier, gets his possessed body back from Elidibus. And then he immediately goes and murders his father, Varys, making Xenos the new ruler of the Garlean Empire. So now, Elidibus, who is possessing the body of Ardbert, is once again trying to tip the scales of light back on the First. So he kind of goes around, starts inspiring all these people to become warriors of light and to go out and kill Sin Eaters. hoping that if they do enough things to move the balance towards light, that the first will tip over and resume the flood of light. The Warrior of Light goes and talks with Hythlodaeus yet again at the simulation of Amarant, and Hythlodaeus gives the Warrior of Light this crystal containing the memories of Azem. So, Azem was one of the Convocation of 14. So back when the world was unsundered, there was this kind of group of people that ruled over the civilization, and they were called the Convocation of 14. It's worth noting that Elidibus, Emet-Selch, and La Habrea were all part of the Convocation of 14. There's also a couple of other Ascians that we've actually already fought at this point, who were part of the Convocation of 14. They were still sundered, but Emet-Selch, Elidibus, La Habrea did give over, like, some memory crystals to, like, kind of show these unsundered Ascians who they once were. So we get a crystal for Azem. Not sure why Hythlodaeus gives it to us. Maybe Emet-Selch intentionally put that into Hythlodaeus to make sure we get the crystal, considering that the Shade of Hythlodaeus was created by Emet-Selch. Makes you wonder kind of, like, what his intentions were. So we go to the Crystal Tower to confront Elidibus, who becomes, like, the embodiment of the Warrior of Light. Again, trying to tip the balance of light in the first. And it turns out that we, the Warriors of Light, use Azem's crystal to free us from the void that Elidibus traps us in. It turns out that our unsundered self was Azem. So, that's kind of why when we fought Emet-Selch, he kind of, acted confused for a minute, because when we kind of fused with Ardbert, Emet-Selch saw a little bit of Azem. And Elidibus starts to see that too. After defeating Elidibus and sealing him within the Crystal Tower, Grahatia also kind of seals himself away. He kind of does this to keep Emet-Selch to keep Elidibus locked within the Crystal Tower, and also, during all this, we're trying to find a way to return all of the Scions back to the source, because the Scions are still trapped over on the first. So Grahatia seals away, and we use his blood to return the Scions to the source. And then we actually go to the Crystal Tower that our Grahatia is sealed away in, and we actually bring him out of that Crystal Tower and give him this, like, memory crystal from the Crystal Exarch. So that way, Grahatia is brought out of the Crystal Tower, joins the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, and has all of the memories of his time in Shadowbringers. Now, there's this rogue Ascian, Fandaniel, who begins to work with Xenos and to set the stage for Xenos' and the Warrior of Light's final battle. Fandaniel reveals himself to the Scions and says, "I want you to die, and I want everyone else to die. I don't care about resurrecting Zodiark. All I want is for everything to end." And Fandaniel reveals that there's also this group of, like, people that he's raised up. I think some of them are Ascians, some of them are might be others, but they're called the Telophoroi, who also share this vision of just wanting everything to end. If we can't have the world sundered, if we can't have the world sundered, and if we can't have the world unsundered, then we don't want the world at all. So several towers start to appear across Eorzea, brought about by Fandaniel and Xenos, and these are using some Garlean technology and some type of energy that are tempering people nearby. So anyone within the proximity of these towers get tempered, as if they were tempered by a primal, and their bodies are actually used to give source to lunar primals. So, we travel to Azizla and free Tiamat from her shackles, and we head towards a tower in Thanalan we head towards the tower in Thanalan, and we confront Lunar Bahamut and defeat them. So, after that battle happens, we hear of Fandaniel talking about this idea called the Final Days, and how it's this big thing that he's planning on bringing about. Fandaniel's going to bring about the Final Days and end everything. Apparently, people in Sharlayan know about the Final Days, or have some idea of what it is. So, the Scions prepare to head over to Sharlayan in order to figure out what the Final Days are. How can they be prevented? What needs to happen? And that's where Shadowbringers ends at. Is knowing the Final Days are coming, and we gotta figure out how to stop them. Yeah, so I mean, I saw it in the chat earlier, people wanting to play Shadowbringers again, and I agree. Shadowbringers was such a really cool expansion. There was a lot of really cool world building for the first that was done so quickly but so well. Emmett Selk was such a great villain. It's like, you know, it's kind of like, oh, what if we were the bad guys? You know, what if we're preventing something good from happening? And yeah, there was a lot of really cool stuff that happened in 5.3, like a lot of really great character moments. But yeah, Shadowbringers, solid expansion. There's a lot to go over for that, for sure. And I skipped over a lot. But we also get a lot of exposition on what the world was like when it was unsundered. So there's a lot of really cool world building that comes about with that, too. But yeah, any questions about Shadowbringers before we move over into Endwalker? Doesn't sound like we have any. Hopefully we don't have too many for Endwalker. I mean, it's all fairly recent. This is a lot more recent stuff, too. So, let's move over into Endwalker. So, Endwalker. We begin Endwalker by hopping on a boat and traveling over to Old Sharlayan. And I just realized I don't have transitions up for these bullet points, so bear with me on that. But we travel to Old Sharlayan under the guise of kind of helping to rebuild these like students of Baldesion, these like followers of Louis Soir, right? In doing so, we kind of split up. The Scions split up to investigate events in both like Thavnair and Labyrinthos. As we kind of snoop around and figure out like what their problems are, and also try to kind of get involved with Sharlayan stuff, we are cut short by the Alphino and Aloyse's father, Fortunal. So Fortunal sees the Scions snooping around and puts them on trial. And in doing so is like, hey, you are forbidden from looking through the archives of Sharlayan. We don't want to see you involved with anything else. And there also seems to be this thing that they want to speak about in regard to the Final Days, but they seem to not be able to do so. So, after visiting, Thavnair and Labyrinthos, we kind of cut things short in Sharlayan, and we go over to Thavnair, because in Thavnair, there is a tower that seems to be tempering a lot of people there, and there's a lot of disappearances happening over in Thavnair. So, saving some captured Thavnairians from Fandaniel, we actually learned that Fandaniel was the elegant scientist Ammon, who existed back in the 4th Umbral Calamity. So, Ammon was one of the bosses in the Crystal Tower raid series, and was kind of like scientist and a big deal in like getting the Crystal Tower up and running, and worked a lot with like Emperor Zande. So, at one point, I think Emmett Selk visited Ammon and revealed to him who he was before the world was unsundered. So Fandaniel has been an Ascian since the 4th Umbral era, and has kind of like the memories of Ammon and like previous incarnations too. So we kind of learn about that. We kind of get some insight into where Fandaniel's coming from, because Fandaniel kind of saw this nation that he helped to build and to advance and move forward, only to see it kind of all crumble, right? And so Fandaniel's kind of seen a couple of civilizations fall at this point, and I don't really think that he has any desire to see more start up, because it's all inevitable and we're all going to die someday. So, after we save the Thavnarians from the tower, and we kind of return things back to normal over at Radzat Han, the main city over in Thavnar, we see that we kind of get these large tower energy readings from Garlemald. And so teaming up with the Eorzean alliances, as well as Doma, I think, they might get involved. No, they get involved later. Anyways, with the Eorzean alliance, the Grand Companies infiltrate Garlemald, and kind of assist some refugees that are around the area at the time. Turns out that Xenos has just been really going full force with his plan and not really caring who it affects, including his own nation. So it turns out in building this tower, the Tower of Babel, which is this giant energy reading, he's tempering all of his own citizens, all of his own people, and Garlemald is more or less destroyed, with the exception of this one really big tower in the middle of it that has this evil glowing energy around it. So, the Warrior of Light and the Scions head into the tower and go up against Anima. Fun fact, turns out Anima is a primal that is made with the flesh of Varys, that is built on the Garleans' desire to not see their nation crumble. So, that's fun. But, the Warrior of Light travels into the Tower of Babel and goes to stop Fandaniel and Xenos from using the Tower of Babel. So it turns out all these towers that have been going up around Eorzea and are all there to feed this giant tower that's in Garlemald. And the purpose of this tower is to destroy Zodiark's seal on the moon. So this giant beam of light shoots out of the tower and goes towards the moon. Hydaelyn intervenes and stops all of the seals from being destroyed, so with no other options left, Fandaniel and Xenos travel to the moon, teleported up by the Tower of Babel, in order to break the remaining seals. So the Warrior of Light follows them over, and Fandaniel, after breaking the final seal, sacrifices himself and becomes Zodiark. Resurrecting Zodiark. Now, Zodiark isn't fully complete, because keep in mind, not all of the rejoinings have happened at this point. But it is still the embodiment of everything the Ascians have been trying to get accomplished so far. So the Warrior of Light does battle with Fandaniel and defeats Zodiark. However, we see that this was actually Fandaniel's goal the entire time. Fandaniel wanted the Warrior of Light to kill Zodiark, because it turns out that, if we remember back in the final days, back in the time when the world was unsundered, there was a calamity that was happening, and that's why they summoned Zodiark. Well, that calamity, the final days, which is what Fandaniel's trying to bring about, was actually blocked by Zodiark. Zodiark brought enough aether around the planet to protect it from the final days. So with Zodiark now gone, there's not enough aether to stop the final days from happening. And that's because there's this other form of energy called dynamis. Dynamis is this form of energy that's kind of spurred on by emotion, but it's less dense than Aether is. Dynamis can be drowned out by enough Aether. And considering that so much of Hydaelyn, the planet, is made up of Aether, Dynamis is pretty difficult to freely interact with. It's much easier to interact with Aether than it is to interact with Dynamis. However, it looks like the final days have some tie to Dynamis. So, the final days start happening now on the planet. With the Aether from Zodiark dispersed, the world is now more weak to Dynamis, or more susceptible to Dynamis. So, after defeating Zodiark, the Warrior of Light travels over to the moon. Oh, this is kind of like what shows up when the world becomes weak to Dynamis, just like as a vision. But the Warrior of Light then it goes and meets the Loporrits. So the Loporrits are a race of bunnies created by Hydaelyn to assist the people of the planet in the event that the final days did come back. Because if the final days did come back, Hydaelyn was decided that the only option left is to evacuate the planet. So essentially, the Loporrits are building a giant ark with the plan to evacuate everybody on the planet now that the final days are here. Now, one of the other consequences of the final days, or one of the main consequences of the final days, is that now the people of the Source are more susceptible to Dynamis. And with the final days coming about, and Distraught taking over people, they begin to transform into these beasts, with outbreaks first really starting to happen around Radz-at-Han. These swarms of abominations. What is happening is, Dynamis, an energy that is, driven by emotion, when all these people are starting to feel distraught and despair, the Dynamis takes over and transforms them into these creatures. So after kind of mitigating some of the crisis in Radz-at-Han, the Warrior of Light is still looking to figure out, what the origin of the final days is and how to stop it. And we're like, who do we know that would know what the final days were like? Well, we did seal. There is only one person that is unsundered that we could talk to, and that's Elidibus, who is over in the Crystal Tower. So we travel back to the First, where we sealed Elidibus inside of the Crystal Tower. And Elidibus uses the tower to transport us back in time to a research facility called Elpis. So now we actually are traveling in the world when it was unsundered, and meeting with people at pretty much their full potential. And the crazy thing is that when we arrive there, they talk about us. They're like, your ether is really light. You're really dense in ether, but it's faint. It's light. So they actually have to give us some ether to kind of get us to the same level as them. And even when they give us ether, we're still not on the same level. Really showing the difference between, what the world would be like if everything was rejoined or not. At Elpis, the Warrior of Light meets the past versions, the fully rejoined, unsundered versions of Emet-Selch, or Hades, and Hythlodaeus, the shade that gave us Azem's crystal in Amaurot. The Warrior of Light also meets Hermes. Hermes is the past self of Fandaniel, who created a being of Dynamis called Meteon. And we also meet Vana, the eventual vessel for Hydaelyn. So breaking this down real quick. I mentioned that Emet-Selch's real name is Hades, right? Emet-Selch is actually a title given to Hades as he joined the Convocation of 14. The same is true for La Habrea. La Habrea is just a title. Elidibus is just a title. So Fandaniel was actually part of the Convocation of 14. And Hermes is Fandaniel before he actually took up the title of Fandaniel. Likewise, we find Vana here. So Vana, we actually find out, is the person who became the vessel for Hydaelyn when Hydaelyn was summoned. She was kind of one of the people who, like, looked at all these sacrifices like, wait a minute, no, like, this isn't right. We learn that she actually formerly held the title of Azem. So Vana was also part of the Convocation of 14. But, to make one thing clear, I mentioned that, you know, us, the Warrior of Light, were formerly Azem. This is not the person who we formerly were. We were not formerly Vana. The idea of the game is to kind of keep, like, the person who was Azem kind of vague, so you can kind of imagine what Azem was like. There's a lot of stories about Azem and what the character of Azem was like. Spoilers, Azem's kind of an adventurer like us. But Vana was the person who formerly held the title of Azem. So, we meet all these people, we kind of tell them about our situation, they don't believe that we're from the future, of course, and yeah. Through all of this, though, I mentioned that Hermes created this being called Medion, and Medion is an Entelechy, and an Entelechy is a creature that can interact with Dynamis. So, Fandaniel, or Hermes, was studying Dynamis at this point, and kind of creating Medion to help. And in part of helping with his studies, he created many sisters for Medion, who he then flung across the stars to all these different planets to kind of, like, figure out, like, hey, what are the states of other planets? Do they know anything about Dynamis? Well, Medion hears from her star-flung sisters, and every world they visited was destroyed. Overrun by something. And this creates this, like, nihilistic view for Medion where she's like, what's even the point if every society that ever does anything good eventually dies? And Medion falls into a deep despair. Medion then escapes from the planet. Real quick note, the planet that we live on is actually called Atheris, not Hydaelyn. Back in the time when the world was unsundered, it was called Atheris, and I think moving forward they're going to refer to the planet as Atheris instead of Hydaelyn, or the source, but those all might be used interchangeably. So Medion escapes, going to the edge of the universe to sing a song of oblivion that invokes the final days. So essentially she's sending these, like, waves of Dynamis to planets to bring them the sweet release of death, essentially. Letting a planet get overtaken by its despair to the point where it destroys itself, because she views it as, like, a mercy on all of these different planets. So, erasing the memories of everyone but, like, us and Vana, because Hermes, Hades, and Hyphodeus were joining us for all these events, they all got their memories erased, except for Vana and us. So Vana bids us to return to the present, and we kind of then go from there to, like, Garlemald and fend off more beasts from the final days. But the thing that I think is really cool is, like, us meeting Vana in the past, and her still having memories of our time together is, like, it's crazy, because it makes sense why she chose us as the Warrior of Light at the beginning of A Realm Reborn, because we actually, like, have this connection to her from the past. So, we then hear from Sharlayans that they are building an ark and plan to evacuate people. I think they were actually working with the Loporrits, maybe, but they were also working on building an ark to preserve their knowledge in themselves. Now, we take a look at this and say, hey, we actually want to go stop Medion, and Medion's at the edge of the universe. Well, how do you get to the edge of the universe? Turns out this ark might actually be able to get us there. So, the Warrior of Light and the Scions bring together all of the different nations. Like, literally every single person that you've interacted with in this game, like, comes back to help bring together resources and build this arc. You see, like, all the beast tribes come together. You see all the different nations come together. You see people from, like, the Alliance raid side quests come together to finish this arc. But there's one thing we still need, and that's an energy source. And so we travel into the Ethereal Sea, and we meet up with Hydaelyn. Because it turns out that Hydaelyn resides in the Ethereal Sea. This is Vana. Vana as the vessel of Hydaelyn. So, we go there, and Hydaelyn says, hey, I have a trial for you. I need to know that you can beat Medion. Because if you can't beat Medion, then everyone needs to evacuate Atheris. So, the Warrior of Light takes on the trial and defeats Hydaelyn, and uses the last of her energy to fuel the arc to confront Medion. So using the last bits of the Mother Crystal, Hydaelyn does die, actually. Like, she dies here, that was like a really powerful scene, but we use the last of her energy to travel to Ultima Thule. Ultima Thule is this place where Medion resides. Medion and all of her sisters reside, and it's like this place of like pure dynamis. And on there, we see all these different, like, kind of similar to how Amarot was, like, this memory of a location. We see these memories of all these planets that have fallen to despair. We get to see, like, the Dragon Star, where Midgardsormr is from. Turns out his planet was destroyed in a war with a machine, with the Omnicrons. We also see the Omnicrons there, which turns out that's where Omega Weapon's from. The Alligans didn't create the Omega Weapon. Turns out the Omega Weapon is this, like, this robot from space that chased Midgardsormr all the way to the source. So we travel to Ultima Thule, and as we go through Ultima Thule, the Scions kind of start to sacrifice themselves in order to give up their dynamis to create a path for the Warrior of Light to get to Medion, and to make the dynamis more stable in the area. So after losing all of their allies, the Warrior of Light revives Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus, who get all of their memories from before they were unsundered, and all their memories with us. And Emet-Selch and Hythlodaeus being revived helps to loosen Medion's grip on her fortress, and bring the rest of the Scions back. So pursuing Medion, the Warrior of Light hops on the back of Xenos, who is in his Shinryu form. And on the back of Xenos, Medion is defeated. Now, Xenos, only coming to help us so he can fight us, battles the Warrior of Light to the death, with the Warrior of Light killing Xenos in one final epic battle at the edge of the universe, with all of the themes from the previous expansions playing in the background, and Xenos is defeated. So the Warrior of Light returns to Eorzea with the Scions. So after that, the Scions of the Seventh Dawn actually disband and kind of go their own separate ways. And the Warrior of Light says, yo, I'm just an adventurer again. I'm just here to explore and see more of the world. And that's what we do. With Astidian, we find this treasure map, and we go to this place, Alzadal's Legacy, and we find this kind of underground temple over by an island. And we discover this portal to the 13th. And turns out the leader of Radz-at-Han, Vitra, Vitra is also one of the first brood, by the way. So Vitra's brothers with Nidhogg, Hraesvelgr, and Vitra's father would be Midgardsormr. But Vitra has actually been the ruler of Radz-at-Han, kind of like posing as a human, using like a vessel, more or less. But Vitra kind of explains the loss of his sister Azhdaya, so another member of the First Brood. So, Azhdaya Azhdaya actually fought against the Allagan Empire back in the Third Astral Era. So, when the Cloud of Darkness appeared, if you remember, I was mentioning that there was kind of this like void gate that opened, right? This giant void gate opens and the Cloud of Darkness comes through. Azhdaya flew up into that portal to try and stop the Cloud of Darkness, and then the portal sealed back up. So Vitra lost his sister Azhdaya to the 13th, to the Void. So the Scions traveled to the 13th. There's Azhdaya. So Azhdaya is somewhere in the 13th at this point. The Scions travel to the 13th and meet Zero. Zero was a Void Sent, and actually, when Xenos was a Reaper, Zero was the Void Sent of Xenos. We meet this character called Zero while we're in the 13th, and we also see a vision of this man named Golbez, who is this man who fought in a war before the 13th became the Void. Because remember, the Void wasn't always that way, right? At one point, it was just one of the shards of the Source, and it became flooded by this like flood of darkness. So the Scions, then Zero kind of recounts the Contra Memoria. So back in the 13th, before the flood of darkness came about, the Ascians were kind of trying to tip the balance towards darkness a bit, right? They were trying to cause a rejoining. And in doing so, they started this war called the Contra Memoria, where Eidolons were being summoned, but there were these crystals that contained like the dark essence of these Eidolons, or like primals. We can call them primals, we can call them Void Sent, whatever. So the Contra Memoria was pretty much these people who took these dark vessels and they started using them. And as they were using the dark essence of these primals, that kind of tipped the scales of the 13th more and more towards darkness. So this war was being fought, and as this war was being fought, people were dying, and darkness was being used more and more and more, and that's kind of what started to build up the flood of darkness. So during this point, over the course of a couple of patches, the Warrior of Light encounters and defeats the Four Fiends. The Four Fiends being these servants of Golbez. And eventually, we discover that, hey, we could open up a Void Gate big enough to travel to the 13th on the moon, using, some of Zodiark's energy, right? And also using some Aether from a dragon to get us over there. So the Scions and Vitra travel over to the moon and open a portal to the 13th, where the Warrior of Light confronts Golbez, and Golbez uses the Aether of Azhdaya to create Zeromus. Zeromus is this big Void Sent that is actually also using Zodiark's Aether. So Golbez is using both Azhdaya and Zodiark's Aether to create this Void Sent. And Golbez is essentially trying to... Golbez was this soldier that fought back during the Contra Memoria War, and his whole deal was there's a whole thing with that. Again, I'm not talking about characters too much in this summary, so I won't go into it too much, but essentially Golbez was a soldier fighting during the war, and he lost a dear friend of his, and he pretty much lost everything. He became a very powerful Void Sent, recollected some of his memories, and now he wants to kind of go over to the Source. And he wants to take over the Source and kind of get some of the darkness out of the 13th and into the Source. So, the Scions travel. The Scions are hey, we need to balance out this light and darkness. If we're going to fight a Void Sent like Zeromus, we need a lot of light in order to do so. Where can we get a lot of light from? Well, probably the first, considering that has an imbalance towards light. So, the Scions travel to the first, and using light from the first that Zero kind of brings into herself, the Scions breach the darkness around Zeromus and defeat the Void Sent. So we defeat Zeromus, and in an interesting kind of turn of events, Zero kind of shows Golbez, like, hey, there are other ways to restore the 13th. Maybe the 13th and the 1st can work together, that we can pour darkness from the 13th into the 1st, and pour light from the 1st into the 13th, in order to bring balance back to those, right? So Zero and Golbez remain in the 13th with the intention of figuring out how to get that light traveling between dimensions to restore both the Void and the 1st. So after that all wraps up, the Scions kind of dust off their hands, go their separate ways again. We are called back to Sharlayan, because Erenville, who is a gleaner from Old Sharlayan, introduces us to Wuk Lamat, who is a woman from Toral. Wuk Lamat invites us to participate in this battle royale, this like tournament of sorts, because there is the winner of this tournament will become the leader of Tuliolao, and she is in line for the throne. So she selects us as her champion, and actually invites several other Scions to come along, either as champions for her, or maybe champions for other competitors in the tournament. She does mention there is someone who is entering this tournament that seems to not really be the best kind of guy. So we don't know too much about him, other than he just does not want the same type of like unity that the current leader of Tuliolao wants. So we're kind of heading into Dawntrail with this like big open continent that we get to explore, but also this tournament that we're kind of fighting for, to make sure that someone becomes the ruler of Tuliolao who values the like cultural diversity and stuff that's already there. So that's how we're heading into Dawntrail. And that kind of wraps up what I have to say about Endwalker. I think I saw one question in the chat earlier. Oh yeah, so like just real quick, wrapping up Endwalker. I think Endwalker was like such a good like bow to put on the 10-year story that is Final Fantasy XIV. I think it was really cool. I think the patch content kind of like suffered a little bit because they ended the story at like 6.0 sharp. And honestly, like, if they pay off some of the stuff from the patch content in Endwalker, like, if you actually do some stuff with the Void and the 1st after this, like, maybe we'll look back and say, like, okay, those patches were kind of cool because it led into this story for, like, another expansion. Like, let's say we do an expansion with, like, the 13th or something. But other than that, I mean, yeah, Endwalker was a really great expansion, and I saw it in chat earlier. Yeah, there was like a really dark scene in Endwalker. Like, honestly, that scene where like Vana was like walking on, and you know Answers was playing in the background. That was such a good scene. But yeah, throw any questions in chat if there are any more. Isn't Limit Break actually Dynamis? Yeah. So we find out that like Dynamis is pretty much the energy that we've been using for Limit Break this whole time. Which makes a lot of sense. Like, essentially, we're being spurred on by emotion. Like, the team's all dead, right? Healer Limit Break 3, right? Or, we're at the end of the fight, he's got 2% left. Let's do, like, melee DPS Limit Break 3. So, yeah, Limit Break is Dynamis. But yeah, that's about all I got at this point. Now all that's left is Dawntrail, which should be dropping in like what, 7-8 hours, something like that. Yeah, I don't have too much else. I tried to keep this as brief as I could because there was a lot to go over, so I had to cut a lot of stuff out. But I hope that those of you who, you know, it's been a while since you looked through some of the story, I hope this was able to like catch you up. I hope this was able to kind of just like, you know, get you ready for Dawntrail and kind of like keep an eye out for certain things. Yeah, so I appreciate everybody for stopping by for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of people showed up, which I was surprised by, so I really appreciate it. But yeah, I think I'm gonna call it there. I'm probably gonna go to bed real soon because I'm gonna try to wake up for the launch. So and I'll be streaming all of it. It's a selfish plug. I will be streaming all of the Endwalker MSQ. Sorry, the Dawntrail MSQ for Endwalker. I think I did a 22-hour stream, so we'll see if I can do that again this year. But thanks again for attending, everybody. I really appreciate it. It means a lot that so many people showed up. I'll be uploading this to YouTube later, so if there's anybody else that you think it would be helpful to see this, send it their way. I'd appreciate any support with that. But yeah, I will see everybody in Dawntrail. I hope for those of you who I'm going to be raiding with, I'm looking forward to it. Everybody else, I mean, I'm sure we'll do dailies and stuff like that. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. I appreciate it. See you in Dawntrail.